The complications of the good things. The months sped by. Jeff made the football team that following year. Brent was in the Boy Scouts, and Hilda in the Campfire Girls. These meetings seemed to keep the whole family going in different directions, for Esther had to do most of the driving. Henry confined himself more and more to his work, for it was a losing battle to keep up with the payments and make ends meet. Why, his gasoline bill alone was astronomical, and he felt that the slightest financial crisis would all but bankrupt him. Then it came. Not a major catastrophe, but a series of minor things that added up to a major crisis in Henry's life. It all began when he awoke in the middle of the night and, as was his custom since the new plumbing was installed, lay there for a moment to listen to the sounds of the house. The house no longer sounded like the home he had known as a boy, nor like the happy home he had known as a man. The familiar creak of the old house, the squeaking of the porch swing, long since removed, upon its rusty hook, the branches of the big pine scraping across the screen of his bedroom window, the soft, lonesome call of the whippoorwill, and the multitude of night noises that had once acted as a tranquilizer upon the tired mind and body of Henry. They were all gone. He couldn't even hear the stately sound of the 80-year-old clock in the living room that had so faithfully told the hour for so many years. In its place was a new sound, the sound of a well-oiled, expensive machine. He had become the chief engineer. No, it was not quite the way it was. Henry thought about it and concluded that he was not master of all he heard, but servant to it. While this enlightening thought was yet upon his mind, he heard it, the steady whir of the pump. He got up, noted that it was 3 a.m., and pulled his pants on reluctantly. Picking up a flashlight in the kitchen, he trudged out to the old spring house and opened the door to discover that the pump was running full speed. It was hot, and there was no pressure showing on the gauge that told you how much water pressure was being delivered to the marvelous plumbing system in Henry's house. He panicked at the very thought of added expense. As he made his way out of the spring house, his light fell momentarily upon the jagged end of pipe that had once delivered the free, cool spring water into the old pitcher pump, now in a junk pile in the old wash over the hill. It was Henry who had sawed it in two as the final act of liberation from the old-fashioned way of life from which he had been delivered into the good things of life. He went back to his bed, and as a tear trickled down his cheek, he wished he had never heard of progress. The next morning, bright and early, Esther called him to tell him that the commode wouldn't flush. The lavatory wouldn't provide water for the children to wash. The coffee couldn't be made, and the washer wouldn't work. Henry told her he had discovered it before she had, and he would do something about it. He thought of that field that had to be mowed today, for rain was due in 3 days, and there was only enough time to get that good hay in the barn before the weather broke. Frustration and then resentment filled his heart as he went to the phone and called the plumber. They were sure they could get to him by Friday, but this was only Tuesday, and what did they expect him to do for water in the meantime? They were sure they didn't know. Henry was sure he didn't know either. In desperation, he asked to speak to the man who sold him the plumbing. After some stalling, he came to the phone, and Henry once more told him his problem, to which the man indifferently replied, "Look, all our customers are in desperate circumstances. We'll get to you as soon as we can, okay? After all, you're not the only person we sold plumbing to." In anger, Henry told Esther she would have to make out the best she could. He had a field to mow, and it wouldn't keep. She retorted, "Well, your precious field can wait. I have a washing to do before the Canasta meeting today, a bath to take, and oh, damn your Canasta Club and your bath and your everlasting running around and your lousy house." Henry found himself shouting to his own surprise. He flew out the door, slamming it behind him, and ran to the barn as his eyes filled with tears. It was the first time he could remember ever having raised his voice to Esther. What was wrong with him? Why was he so irritable and short-tempered? Why was he constantly frustrated within and angry with everything and everyone? Ashamed, he came home late that evening, and Esther was especially cool to him, as he expected her to be, and for which he couldn't blame her. The children were busy with TV, and his supper, what there was of it, was cold. He ate in silence and went to his room to read so that he would not interrupt the children in the living room. They never saw him go upstairs, and later Hilda asked, "Did Daddy ever come in?" Jeff said, "Seems like I haven't seen him for weeks. Where does he keep himself?" Henry tried to read, but the words blurred before his eyes. He tried to think, but thoughts wouldn't come. He turned out the lights, but trying to sleep without Esther was like trying to breathe without air. So he just lay there in the darkness, afraid, confused, and not certain about anything or anyone. While Esther was still in bed the next morning, Henry had a cup of instant coffee by himself and hurried to the barn. The horses had gotten out during the night and had eaten or trampled down most of the small sweet corn patch next to the barn, and so the day didn't start off too well. He harnessed them to the mowing machine, determined that he'd get his good hay laid down today, no matter what. And just as he was ready to leave the barn lot, Hilda came running to the barn to tell him that he was wanted on the phone. When he got there, out of breath, he was greeted by a man wanting the Mr. Morgan that sells chickens, and since Henry didn't sell chickens, he was sure he had the wrong number. Henry went slowly back to the barn, wondering whose idea it was to put him in instant touch with 3 billion human beings. Going to the field, he made great progress. The sky was clear, the breeze warm, and the sun bright. The mowing machine clicked beautifully. As he decided to make one more round before lunch, he felt a sudden snap. He stopped to examine the mower and found he had snagged a small stump that he knew was there, but somehow had forgotten in his preoccupation. The stump had done its work. The drag bar had broken neatly in two, and Henry felt like crying. The field of good hay half down, with bad weather on the way according to the last TV weather bulletin, and a broken mower. Finding a piece of baling wire large enough to hold it together, he started for the barn, trying to work out some emergency plan. There was only one thing he could do, and that was get to town as quickly as possible and buy a part for the mower. He unhitched the horses, put them in the barn, and almost ran to the house. When he arrived, the first thing he noticed was that the car was gone. A note on the round kitchen table told him the bad news. "Henry, I've gone to Chamberstown to visit friends. Since you were going to be in the hayfield all day, and since you never did anything about the plumbing, I can't stay here without water. There are plenty of TV dinners in the freezer. I'll be back when school's out. Esther." Oh, this was all he needed. His mind was working like clockwork. He tried to think who she might be visiting. Making 3 calls to the most likely places and getting no results, he sat down on the kitchen chair and stared out into space. With a burst of inspiration, he ran to the phone and called the only tractor dealer in Chamberstown who carried parts for his mower. The man told him that the part wasn't in stock, but that it was in stock in Dexter City, 27 miles from Chamberstown. The best he could do was to call and have them put it on the evening bus, and Henry could pick it up tomorrow. Agreeing reluctantly, he hung up, wondering what would happen next. He didn't have long to wait to find out. Going to the freezer, he discovered that the TV dinner he had chosen for his lunch was soft and flabby, which even to Henry didn't seem right. Returning swiftly to the freezer and raising the lid, he saw what he was afraid he would see. Everything in the freezer was soft and flabby. It was still plugged in. The electricity was still on, and beyond that, Henry couldn't know what was wrong. He raced to the phone and dialed the power company, only to be told he had the wrong number, that he really wanted to call the appliance division. He called the right number and got the wrong people. For this time he was told he wanted appliance repair department. He hung up and dialed the repair department to find the line busy. 5 more attempts in the next half hour produced the same results. Finally, in desperation, he called the operator and asked her to check the line. She did, and found out that it was temporarily out of order. Like a cornered animal, Henry decided he wasn't whipped yet. He called the power company and told them his problem. They agreed to send someone to the repair division with the message. They would get in touch and said for Henry to stay close to the phone. He did, and after eating his soggy TV dinner and drinking 2 cups of instant coffee, there wasn't much to do but pace the floor and think about the good things in life that had come to him. He remembered how the old cellar house had never quit running, and the cool, free spring water had always flowed into his house without fail. And he wondered if the time and labor-saving devices had really saved him time, labor, money, or anything. Henry felt angry, frustrated, and unhappy. If only Esther were here and he could hear her say, "Don't worry, Henry. Nothing will change as long as we don't change." Then we must be changing, Henry concluded out loud, for our life has surely changed. But he wondered how it could be when he had been so determined not to change. Henry had never discovered that there was an outside influence at work changing him and Esther, an influence neither one could fight. His thoughts were interrupted by the demanding ring of the phone, and Henry answered to hear an efficient man from the power company on the other end. "Did you call for the repair division, Mr. Morgan?" Henry said he surely had, and that his deep freeze was not working. No, he didn't know how long it had not been working. Yes, he had looked at the plug. No, he had not checked the fuse because everything else was working. Yes, he was sure the electricity was on because he had just warmed water for instant coffee. The man said it was now past 3 o'clock and there would be no chance of coming today, but he'd get to him sometime tomorrow. When Henry pressed him to come sooner, explaining that he had a whole beef plus many other food items in that freezer, the man sympathetically told him that there was a widow with 7 children on Laurel Fork whose deep freeze had been out for 3 days and they were still trying to get to her. But he assured Henry, though they were snowed under, they were doing the best they could, what with 2 men on vacation and all, and Henry silently wished he were literally snowed under, and then the freezer would be no problem. Since there was nothing more to say, Henry said to come as soon as possible, and the man said by noon tomorrow at the very latest. While Henry was unharnessing the horses at the barn, Esther came in driving very slowly, and he met her just as she was getting some things out of the back seat. "Oh, hi, Henry," she said. "Do you mind helping me out with these things?" He said he would help, and he filled his arm with things and wanted to ask what they were, but thought he didn't dare. She put his mind at ease. "Lois and I went to Sears to look around this afternoon, and you know those curtains I've been wanting for the living room? Well, they were on sale. Now, they weren't the color I wanted, but they'll do. And Henry, wait till you see the darling dresses for Hilda that were on sale, too." Henry thought she had plenty of dresses, and Esther reminded him that she was hard to fit, and she had to buy them when she could find them. Henry also wondered why the new sewing machine was in the stair closet all packed away, but then Esther was plenty busy most of the time. He carried the things into the house, and as he started out again, Esther dropped the bomb. "Henry, I want to tell you, there's something funny wrong with the car. I thought it wasn't going to start when I came out of Sears. It just made a funny groaning noise, and I noticed all day the little red light was on." He said he'd see about it, and he did. The battery was dead, and so he went in, and after a phone call to the garage in Willoughby, he discovered that the generator was probably not operating. Now, Henry didn't know too much about generators, but after a little information from the garage man, Henry got his tools and tried to take it off. It was a hard job with only a pipe wrench and some open-end wrenches, but after only 2 busted knuckles, Henry got it off. Even he could smell the burnt wiring and knew he'd found the trouble. He called the man at the garage, but in the meantime it had closed, and though Henry did succeed in getting Fred Danner on the line, and Fred said he could ride to town tomorrow morning with him if he wanted to take the generator, Henry said he would have to, whether he wanted to or not, for he had to get to Chamberstown tomorrow for the part for his mower. Agreeing on 8:30 in the morning, Henry sat down to his cold supper alone. After supper, he drifted into the living room and took a seat in the corner. He hoped that maybe they could talk a little on the porch like they used to, but then the porch wasn't too good a place to sit. The noise of the traffic was bad for one thing, and then Esther said she didn't like to sit out there where everyone could stare at you when they went by, and furthermore, if you sat out there very long, somebody would take it as an invitation to visit the rest of the evening, and nobody felt up to that. He noticed that the program they were watching was just about over, and he was determined that he'd suggest a family night as soon as the commercial started. In a few minutes, he blurted out, "Anybody for dominoes?" No answer. "How about a good checker game?" Children began to say to each other, "Why don't you play Daddy a game?" And were answering with, "Why don't you?" Finally, Esther said in an apologetic voice, "Oh, I think they were wanting to watch the Virginian, Henry." "Boy, Dad, you'll really love it," said Jeff. "It's about the outdoors." Henry decided that maybe he really would enjoy it, so he settled back in his chair, but during the first gunfight, he fell asleep. Esther roused him to tell him the 11 o'clock news was just coming on, and he'd better get to bed if he was going to go with Fred Danner the next day. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he said without turning around, "Esther, I'm sorry about yesterday and the things I said. I don't know why I lost my temper, but I've been so nervous and irritable lately. Can't sleep like I used to, and there've been so many things on my mind." She sat down and put her arms around him and said, "I understand, Henry. Part of it was my fault, and I'm sorry, too. I love you, and I want you to feel like your old self again. I've noticed you've been tired and run down lately, and while I was in town, I stopped to see Dr. Manson. He said you should come in for a checkup right away, and I promised him I'd speak to you about it." Now, Henry couldn't remember when he had ever been to a doctor. He had his tonsils out when he was a boy, and that seemed to be the only time he could recall. But, well, he was past 40 now, and a man's health does change. With Esther's concern so obvious, Henry soon agreed to see Dr. Manson for that checkup, and kissing Esther good night, he was soon asleep.